Entry 1. Dio, no matter what happens, live nobly and with pride. If you do that, you'll surely be able to go to heaven. My mother always used to tell me that. I wonder if she did indeed go to heaven. She lived at the bottommost rung of society, but she lived with a pride that she never lost. Despite that, or rather because of that, she couldn't have obtained a ticket to heaven. I don't think so. She was noble, proud, pure, righteous, beautiful, goddess-like. But she was a hopelessly foolish woman. Take this, for example. While we were so impoverished we would be worried for the day's food, while both she and I, her son, starved, she shared the paltry sum of money she earned with the hungry children of the neighborhood. And not just the children, elderly people, or sometimes animals. She gave charity and blessings to such weaklings like it was her duty. What's the word? Kindness. She would scatter it freely to those around her. What was that, if not foolish? One can't help but hate it. Her self-sacrificial way of life was certainly noble and proud, but in that dead-end town there was no one to assess that nobility and pride. In a place such as where the Joestars lived, that sort of idyllic country town, such character would be reasonably recognized, but where we lived, a town built from ditches, she was only ever a laughing stock. The children who took her charity, as well as the elderly people, all laughed at her. They roared with laughter, as if she were a clown playing a hilarious joke. And when I heard that laughter, I didn't really have much animosity to it. They were absolutely right, I thought. Enough so that I wanted to laugh right along with them. My anger at her took precedence, so of course I didn't laugh. But that only proves the extremity of my rage. My mother was foolish, helplessly foolish. Be that as it may, I was the son of a mother who was made fun of, and as you might expect, I too was looked down on. And I couldn't let the people who laughed at my mother get away with it, but when I hurt them, my mother scolded me. She defended those who mocked her. She would chastise me for getting angry. You mustn't do that, Dio. You mustn't live relying on violence. If you do such things, you will not go to heaven. Thinking back, it was like her favorite phrase. Words themselves have concrete meanings. Maybe they were rather more like an incantation, for her simply saying those words left an impression on me. She needed only to say the word heaven, and I think she felt like she might be saved. I had to think that, because otherwise that woman's feelings were completely incomprehensible to me. No, even if I did think that, she was impossible to empathize with. But, in hindsight, I feel that it brought some light into her life in which she was constantly derided. Anyhow, she, my mother, took every opportunity to say it to me, her young child. If you do this, you can't go to heaven. If you do that, you'll surely go to heaven. Heaven, 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 and every time it irritated me. My young mind learned severe irritation. I thought of them as irrational words. I couldn't forgive my mother. That's why whenever I would see my drunken father assault her, it actually made me feel relieved. Serves you right, I thought. Thinking about it now, it's idiotic, but as a young child, I liked my father more than my mother. My low-life, insignificant, good-for-nothing father was much better than my noble, proud mother. If my mother was a giver, or perhaps a donor, then I think I could say my father was a taker. I never once saw him work. I never saw him work or earn anything for himself. Through gambling, swindling, and extortion, he took cash and food from people in town. He never earned, he only took, always. Until his death, he was my mother's foil, her opposite. And in our town, my father was right. My father's way of living was honest and correct. I thought my father, uninhibited, cunning, I thought he was cool. I don't think I looked up to him, but I respected him. It really seems idiotic now, but then I was not in my proper senses. I thought of him as very skilled. Always taking from the weak, beating others with or without provocation. For a still innocent child, one couldn't be stronger. To see now that my connection with the Joestars, what shaped my fate for a century, began from my father's thieving habits. The moment this taker took from George Joestar became the origin, the impulse. Like gravity, his actions still have a pull on my destiny. But as a child, the attraction I found in his actions were more naive. I watched him. I learned from him. I envied him. He was strong, stylish, cool. In that broken down slum, knowing that my father was such a person was my life's greatest and only pride. But my mother repudiated that. She downright criticized it. "Dear, please stop. Let's give back all the money you stole. You mustn't do these things. If you do things like this, you won't go to heaven." Whenever she said that, she got hit. A foolish woman said foolish things and was beaten. After she collapsed, he'd violently kick her and throw liquor bottles at her. I only found out about it later, but apparently my little brother or sister that could have been was lost to that violence. It's a cruel story. It's a cruel story, isn't it? It surely is. But among that daily violence, she was forthright to the end. In that life at the bottom rung of society, in that terrible environment, she talked about justice, ethics, and morals. She held dearly those things that served no purpose at all, like they were treasures. I wish she'd just shut up. At the least, I wish she'd have overlooked my father's actions. If she'd done that, she would have escaped his violence. Or would she? When I think of my father in his drunken frenzies, you probably couldn't escape completely, no matter what you did. But when I was a child, in my attempts to do that, I would stay quiet and get away from him when he drank, and that would minimize the amount of damage I received. A child could figure that out, but she never did. Quite the opposite. When my father drank heavily, inebriated beyond sense, she remonstrated him. "You mustn't drink so much liquor," and the like. She would say obvious things like that. She would get hit and yet say such obvious things. What exactly was going to come from saying things like that? If you thought about it, it should have been easy to figure out. Seeing her try to talk to my father, despite the fact that she did nothing to defend herself, couldn't be called anything but humorous. It's strange. I can't help but question it. Even if she couldn't escape others' scorn, she should have at least been able to escape the violence. So why didn't she? Is it, as I thought, she was simply foolish? Because she wasn't smart? Was my mother really a hopeless idiot? That's wrong. Now that 100 years have passed, I know that's wrong. Now that I know the outside world and the next world. It's true that my mother at least had intelligence and education. Even in poverty, when I could not go to school, she taught me various things in place of a teacher. It's because I had that basic education that I was able to live with such determination later. I never once thanked my mother for that while she was alive. And though I thought such an education couldn't serve any purpose, if it weren't for her, I couldn't have lived with the refined, elegant Joestars. I never cared about my mother's bloodline, but when I did investigate, I found that she may have actually come from the upper echelons of society. Here I'll state something bigoted. Her refinement and dignity, her piety, were completely at odds with her poverty. They could not have been nurtured in a slum. They must have been things born out of a life of luxury. But why would such a woman marry such a man? Why would she fall into this miserable town? These I can only label mysteries. Speaking of which, my father once told me something while drunk. Something about him eloping with my mother. "How's that for love and romance?" he said, among other such worthless drivel. I dismissed it as drunken nonsense, but I don't know whether or not it was true. I ignored it as it seemed like an incredibly hard story to swallow. I can't confirm it now, but I suspect it may not have been nonsense. Perhaps my father had said something truthful. I regret not asking. Dio, don't blame your father. Your father is really a kind person. He just shouldn't drink. If he'd only quit drinking, I'm sure your father would work diligently. My mother said that often, too. with a serious look on her face, and I would think, now that is nonsense. It took all I had not to cry out at her. I wanted to ask how she could possibly be so naive. He's really a kind person? If only he stopped drinking? How or where could you look, or in what way could you try to explain it in order to think these things? All I could think was that my mother had lost her mind from being beaten too much. If one assumed that, one could even say that they were actually a very well-matched couple, him taking, her giving. But no matter how you thought about it, they were an incredibly mismatched couple. For my mother, who made it a principle to do good, who aimed to go to heaven, to live with such a man must have been torture. Or perhaps for her it was the most charitable thing she could do. Perhaps she thought that staying at his side, remaining married to him for life, that was a mission given to her by God. Something along those lines. It's an audacious hypothesis I have no basis for, but unless I think it was something like that, I really can't understand her. She was far too full of contradictions. She was the laughingstock of the town, but she still tried to help them. She was beaten bloody by her husband, but she still tried to serve him. Every day she worked to the brink of collapse. And seeing as one day she really did collapse and died, nothing can be said to explain her actions. I wonder, in the end, did she get to heaven? I don't think she did. Surely she couldn't go anywhere. She had nowhere to arrive at, and nowhere to return.